In this video, we'll walk through a simple application that really demonstrates the capabilities of two-way data binding in the wrec library. Over on the right, you see what is in this user interface. I have an input where I can type a comma-separated list of names of colors. Below that, I have a set of radio buttons. Below that, I have a select, which contains the same options that are in the radio buttons. Then I have a number slider where I can change the size of the text below. Selecting a different radio button changes the color of the text and also updates the select to have the same option selected. Selecting a different option from the select updates the color of the text and the radio button. And finally, I can go up to the input at the top and type a different list of colors. And when I press return or tab out of that input, everything updates. It automatically selects the first of those colors. The radio buttons update, the select updates. I can even go back to the input and ask for more colors, and everything updates as expected. And selecting those new colors uses them for the text below. So how do we implement all of this? Looking over on the left, we have our definition of the radio group web component. Like the ones you've seen before, it extends from the wrec class. And then we have the static property form associated set to true. What this does is enable embedding instances of this web component in an HTML form and making it so that if I submit the form, the value of the selected radio button will be submitted along with it. It turns out there's a fair bit of work you need to do in web components in order for that to work. But the wrec library takes care of that for you. All you have to do is set the static property form associated to true. Next, we have our list of properties for this component. I have 3 of them that are required. Labels is a comma-separated string, which are the labels I want to display next to the radio buttons. Name is important because all of the inputs that represent the radio buttons need to have the same value for name, and that's what enforces having only one of them selected at a time. Values is a comma-separated string of the value associated with each radio button, corresponds to the labels. And finally, value is telling me which of the radio buttons is selected right now. That's not a required attribute, and if you don't specify it, it will just automatically select the first of the values. The CSS is fairly straightforward. I just want to lay out the radio buttons horizontally using flex layout and have a gap of a half rem between them. Each of the radio buttons is represented by a div that contains an input of type radio followed by a label. And I want those to be laid out horizontally. So I've got display flex, and then the align items center makes it so that the label is vertically aligned with the radio button. The HTML is going to iterate over all of the values, and so I take that comma-separated list of values and I split on the comma and then map over those. I could embed inside this the logic for building each of the radio buttons, but it's simpler to move that to a separate method. So that's what the make radio method does. And when I call that, I want it to be evaluated in the context of this instance of the web component, and that's the purpose of .bind this. And so the map method is passing to that one of the values, the one that I'm iterating over, and also its index. And so if I scroll down to make radio, you see that that method does take a single value and an index. I'm trimming the value just in case your comma-separated string contains some spaces. And then for each of those values, I want to create a div that has inside it an input of type radio followed by a label. The input has the name attribute that was passed in. Again, that's so that I make sure that all my radio buttons are associated and only one at a time can be selected. If you select one of those radio buttons, I'm calling the handle change method. And handle change is defined up here on line 69. That is going to be passed an event, and I can get the value from that event and assign that to my value property. Okay, and that's holding which one of the radio buttons is selected right now. Finally, down on line 85, I need to determine whether this radio button should have the checked attribute, and it should be checked if the value associated with this radio button is the one that is selected right now. And so in that case, I'm including the checked attribute. Otherwise, I'm not going to include it. And then the label element is displaying the proper label. Notice I'm pulling it out of this private property label array, which we haven't talked about yet. I'll get to that next. And so I just pulled that out by index. It's the one that corresponds to the value whose radio button I'm rendering right now. All right, so let's talk about what the private property label array is. So going up to the top here, right after I define my HTML, I've got the private label array property set to an empty array. And then scrolling down to attribute changed, well, this is going to be called if any of my attributes are changed. And so I'm calling the superclass method, and then I'm doing special things based on which of my attributes changed. If the value has changed, then I need to update the check state of my radio buttons and make sure that the new value is the one that is selected. And so I'm iterating through them and setting their checked property based on whether it matches my new selected value. If the comma-separated string of labels have changed, then I need to update my label array. And so this is updating the property that we have up here on line 35. I'm just splitting that comma-separated string that is in the labels property. And finally, if the values comma-separated string changed, then I need to call fix value. And the reason for that is that it's possible that the value does not match any of the ones in the array. And so I'm splitting my comma-separated string of values, and I'm checking to see whether the new value is in that array. If it is not, then I'll just select the first one. Going back to the connected callback, here I'm doing a similar thing. I'm making sure that the value that was specified is either going to be the first one, or if I don't have a value, this fix value method fixes that so that it will select the first one if the value you specified isn't present in that array. So that's everything about this component. Of course, at the bottom, I need to register the component, which is going to give us the custom element radio-group, all lowercase. The select list component is fairly similar to this. It also extends wrec. It also has form associated set to true. It takes a name, which is useful for submitting this as part of a form. Then it takes a comma-separated list of labels, a comma-separated list of values that correspond to those labels, and then which one of the options is selected right now is given to me by the value property. The static HTML property says that what I want to render is a select element that uses that name, and the currently selected option is going to be whatever matches this dot value. Then I want to iterate over the parts of my comma-separated list of values, map over them, and then, like we saw in radio group, I'm calling a method inside this class to render out each one of those. So make option does that for me. And so if I scroll down to take a look at that, that's just going to give me an option for each one. It's passed a value in an index, and so I can create an option whose value is whatever was passed in, trimmed in case there were some extra spaces there. And then I need to look up in my label array what label corresponds to that value. And like in radio group, I'm building out that label array in the same way. It's a private property that starts out as an empty array, and whenever the attribute labels changes, I need to update that. Looking at connected callback, if the value is not present, then I'm going to select the first one by default. And then again, fix value is just making sure that if value doesn't correspond to something in my array, then I'll just set it to the first of those. So with those two components in hand, and also having the number slider component from our previous video, I can build out a web component that combines all of these things. And so data binding is a component that extends from wrec, and it has these properties. It has a currently selected color. It has a comma-separated list of colors. I have labels, which in this case is going to be a computed property. And the reason it's computed is that I just want to take my list of colors that are going to be all lowercase, and I want to build labels that are just capitalized versions of those. And so I'm making this a computed property. You see on line 12 that it's commented out. One way that I could implement this is to just throw all the code there as a single JavaScript expression. And that certainly works, but it's a bit messy. And so what I decided to do instead is add a method in this class called getLabels that will essentially do the same thing. But there is a problem. How will wrec know when to call getLabels again? Because I'm not passing anything to this method. And so I need to help it out and tell it that if the value of colors changes, that's a cue that it needs to call this method again and update my labels property. And so that's the purpose of this uses property. So let's take a look at getLabels. So getLabels splits my comma-separated list of colors, and it maps over them and calls capitalize on each one, and then joins them together to build my comma-separated list. And capitalize is defined up at the top here, where I pass in a string, and if I have a string, then I grab the first character and uppercase it, and then concatenate on the rest of the characters. Otherwise, just return whatever the value of str was. The size property is a number which starts at 18. I'm using that for my text size. Going down to the CSS, I want to lay out all of these things as a column. And we see over on the right that I have a vertical list of all of the components. I want to have a half of a rem in between them. And then the paragraph tag at the very bottom is going to use a specific color. And so I have this variable -- color that's going to get its value from the property this.color. Similar for -- size, it gets its value from the property this.size. And now I can use the color variable to set the color of the paragraph tag, and I can compute my font size. The variable -- size is just a number. I need to tell it that the units are pixels, and so I need to multiply by 1px to get that. Looking at the HTML, here's where we lay everything out. So I have a div at the top with the label color options, and then an input where I can type in my list of colors. And that's going to have a two-way binding to the property this.colors. Then I have my radio group. The name here is not particularly important. I'm not using this as part of a form, but it is making it so that each of the radio buttons is associated with the same name. Then I have my list of labels, the currently selected color, and my comma-separated list of colors. And I'm passing the same things to select list, and because they're referring to the same properties, when those properties change, they'll update both the radio group and the select list. And then at the bottom, I've got my number slider tied to the property this.size. Finally, we have the paragraph tag where I display some sample text, and the text name of that color will get inserted right here. And at the bottom, we register this component, and so I'll now have a custom element whose name is data-binding. And the last piece is to use this in an HTML file. All I need to do is have a script tag for each of my components, and then I need to say I want to render data binding. I want to begin with the color blue selected and give it the comma-separated list of colors. And as we saw, it's going to compute the labels from that, and so the labels will just be the capitalized versions of those. And so there you have it. I think this is a pretty impressive demo given how all the data binding works, and there's really very little code that we had to write to make this work. I encourage you to think about how you might implement this same thing using another framework or even another web component library. I hope you've learned something from this video, and check out my blog page on the wrec library to learn even more.